This is the 11th of May 2017, and the interview is with Dr. Karl Kollman, and to discuss the Daimler-Benz aero engines. Karl, can we perhaps begin by discussing a little bit your father's early entry into engineering and his studies and so on?
He studied in Munich, and then after his diploma, he went to Berlin and worked with Borsig. And then he returned to Munich and got a facility to work the scientific theme at Professor Nusselt. He was a famous thermodynamic specialist at the university, and so he made his doctor thesis there. And afterwards, when he finished it, he returned to Berlin, and then from there he got the offer to turn over to Daimler-Benz in 1933, and so he went here together with the family and started his work there. And he got the responsibility for the design of the engines. At first he started at normal manner, starting with special problems, and then he climbed up to the top of this department, and he at last was the head of the engine design department, aero engine design department.
And do you know which were the first engines that Professor Kollman worked on at Daimler?
I think in 1933 they were still in building up this row of engines, which is called the DB 600, and so I think that his first works were linked with 601 engine, which was then developed into different stages with just a problem getting it able to run the aeroplanes in higher levels. So the charging of the engine was one problem which had a very high priority, and so this was also his main work, I think, that he dealt with.
And in several of the papers I've read written in Germany in the 1930s, there are several written by Professor Kollman, and also there are some written by Dr. Werner von der Null,
Yeah.
who worked at the DVL.
Yeah.
Do you know if the two of these men ever met?
I didn't meet Dr. von der Null, but the name was familiar to me because my father also told us of the meeting. Dr. von der Null was very special person because he was the head of this DVL you mentioned already. And this was a central research institution in Berlin, and they observed all the developments which went on in Germany. This was a difference to Britain, that in Germany not only Daimler-Benz developed engines for aeroplanes, but also, for instance, Junkers and BMW and Heinkel and many others. And so von der Nüll had the task to bring this together and to combine it in such a way that the best of all was introduced to the main objects.
And so I've read several papers in which von der Nüll and Professor Kollman they mention the work of the other.
Yes.
So
yes.
Clearly they knew what the other was developing
yes.
at the time. And perhaps we could talk a little bit next about your father's early meetings and impressions with two of the senior men at Daimler, Friedrich and Nehlinger.
Yeah. Nehlinger. Well, Friedrich, of course, was the direct boss of my father. He was the head of the complete aero engine development, and my father was responsible for the design. And Nehlinger, he was the head of the engineering development department, development of Daimler-Benz at all, the whole. Also the engines and cars which have been produced at that time at Daimler-Benz. So he was the head of engineering development at all, Nehlinger. And he was a very interesting person, and because he had very good contact to the development work of my father, he sometimes visited us. And so I had also personal contact with Nehlinger. And I told you already the story with Herr Friedrich that we had the chance to get his flat after the war when we returned to Stuttgart. It was really good luck.
And I don't know if maybe you were too young during the war itself, but I don't know if you have any impression about how it was to work as a senior engineer for Daimler during the war. I don't know if your father ever told you if it was perhaps very interesting or frightening, or how it was for him to work during this time.
We didn't speak a lot about technical things because I was too young to understand it really. I was only 5 years old.
Yes.
But nevertheless, of course, we were confronted with the aeroplanes, either by the bombers which came from Britain, and sometimes, of course, we also experienced testing in the air over our house. And the third thing was that we permanently heard the noise from the test stands in the Stuttgart plant where they tested the engines, and this was a noise which filled the whole valley. And it was also a certain signal for us. If the noise stopped suddenly, then we had to calculate a new bombing because they knew it first. And they stopped all activities at the Daimler-Benz plant, which very often was the target of the bombers too. And because we were very close to the plant, our flat was not far away, we were always in a certain contact with the activities in the plant. And so this was our direct connection with the development of these engines.
In later years, I don't know if you ever discussed with your father long after the war, maybe what maybe some of the biggest difficulties were for the engineering work that they had to do at Daimler during this time.
Of course, the targets they had was always to increase the power and to build engines who enabled the airplanes to get higher and higher, because this was an important feature in the fight, that they could get very high elevations and higher than the British could. And so they always compared, of course, the power of the British engine development and the power of the British engines with their own. And so they were always very well informed about the activities at Rolls-Royce. This he told me, of course, later on, and it was very interesting now for him too that the activities in Germany, later activities in Germany after the war with the turbo engines were united with the Rolls-Royce activities here in Germany, and still existing this company in Munich.
In England, at the airfield called Duxford, they have there the stores of all the technical documents that were taken
Yes.
from Germany during this time, and there are very many references to your father's work in the papers there. So there are card indexes of the names of the most important designers and chemists and
Yes.
physicists from Germany. I found a lot of papers written by your father, and it seems that about 1944, or maybe a bit earlier even, that a lot of his work was moved to the turbojet.
Yes, that's right.
Away from
That's right.
the
Yes,
piston
from
engine.
the piston engines. Of course, as I told you before, it was really the end of the development of the piston engine. The end of the war was also the end of the piston engine for airplanes, because there was no technical possibility to make further development. And the turbo engines opened now much better chances to get higher output and to solve the problem with higher elevation of the flights. And so it was quite natural that this start of the new engine technology had to come. And this already started in 1944, something like that, or even 1943, I'm not so sure about this. And this was then continued after the war. And one of the gentlemen who was one of the leading engineers was Dr. Eckert, whom I met later on in in Stuttgart when I worked at Daimler-Benz too. And he was in a certain kind the follower of this technology after the war, and therefore he has written a history of the development of aero engines. And in this history you can find already also quite good descriptions of the turbo engines they developed. And I told you already that the French, after the war, also tried to use this special knowledge, and they asked my father to work with them in a new development office they had founded in Bregenz, and they invited my father to work with them. And this was the starting of the French company Turbomeca. And this is still existing in the south of France. And for us and for our family, it was threatened that we had to go to France as well, because my father had no other job after the war. And so this work with Turbomeca seemed to be very successful. But it was good luck that he got another job later on and we could stay in Germany. I have nothing against the French, and it was quite good that I, as a young boy, already was forced to learn French. This helped me later in school.
When I was reading some of the British reports about Daimler and also Junkers and the rest, so there was a report written for the engineers who first arrived at the factory, and they had to write a kind of evaluation of what they found and the facility and so on. And I was wondering, do you know where your father was when first the
Americans came?
The troops arrived. What was he doing?
Yes, in southern Germany, in this area here, the Americans came first. Well, the French also came until Stuttgart, and on the one side of the Neckar River, the French were on the other side, the Americans. And they were not quite the same, had not the same idea in which area they had could be placed. Well, we were on the American side, and my father at that time did not work at the plants in Stuttgart anymore because it was nearly totally destroyed, and they had taken out the offices to a place, a small town about 30 kilometers east. This was Göppingen. Göppingen is well known to all children because in Göppingen there's a factory of Märklin toys. I don't know, this little trains, Märklin trains. This is in Göppingen. And there was also a factory of a shoe factory. And they didn't build shoes at that time in this factory. My father had his new office, and when the Americans came, he received officially the Americans in his office and gave everything over to the Americans. And so the material they found, they have transported somewhere, I think, to America, mainly. Yeah, and this was also the end of the activities of my father. And from Göppingen, he went then to our flat in Heidenheim. This was further east, and he passed all the entering American tanks and so on a bicycle, passed them to get to our home in Heidenheim, where dramatic things happened, because when the Americans came to Heidenheim, they at first have shot some grenades into the town, and some of them just landed in our roof, and we had the top flat there under the roof, and so it started burning. It was very dramatical. We distinguished the fire, yes, and then, but the neighbor house, they burned down to the ground. And so when my father came there on this bicycle, he found all these burning houses there, and it was dramatic because the fire brigade wasn't able to distinguish the fire because they didn't have water, and they had no fuel for their pumps. And then my father went on his bicycle to the Voigt company, which was in Heidenheim. Voigt is perhaps known to you. It is a big company today. Also today they produce turbines. And at that time my father knew the head of Voigt, and he went to him and met him in his house and told them that problems, that they couldn't distinguish the fire, we need some fuel. And Herr Voigt had some fuel in his garden. And he gave him one little tank of this fuel, and so he went on the bicycle back, and the fire brigade could start again to distinguish the fire. This was the end of the war for us. It was really dramatic, but at any way we survived. And so it was good that my father knew this person, and nobody had a idea how the fire brigade could get some more fuel again. There was nobody who could help them.
When I first visited you, I was amazed to see that your father had written such a large book on his work, his technical work during the war, which I think he finished writing in
1947.
1947.
Yeah.
Do you know why he decided to record his work?
He had a lot of material still in his private possession, and not everything was taken away by the Americans. And he had the idea that this should be kept, really, and the things were very, very important for his further development too, because I don't know if you know, he was, when he returned to Daimler-Benz in 1949 or something like that, he started the development of automatic gears for cars. And there he could use all his knowledge for this converters he had developed for the superchargers. And this was a technology which helped him a lot later on when he started the development of the gearboxes. And so he started there also with a new technology which was unknown at that time. The American automatic gearboxes didn't have such a converter like this Föttinger Wendler, that was the official name. And he also had developed already two-stage converters. And so in the automatic gearboxes they had already the first gear step in the already in the converter, and the mechanical gears they needed only three, but the whole gear then had kind of four gears, and so this was already an advantage against American products which were on the market. So he could use really the knowledge, and I think this was also good for Daimler-Benz at that time.
From looking at the papers that of your father that you've found at the Daimler factory, it looks to me like the final piston engine that your father was working on, this 603N. I think this was the kind of the final piston engine work done by your father.
Oh, well, it was the final work on a piston engine of this size, but later on when he was at the university and he made research work, he did a lot in the field of bearing, and this was all for piston engine, and this was also an advantage for me because I could use later on the results he had worked out at his institute in the Karls University. I could use them in my work at Daimler, and I remember that I had quite success with it when the first engine was built up with a advice to form the bearings according to the results of my father's research work, that we found less friction of about 5 or 10 horsepower, which was a big success at that time. And so there's still a connection between the work of my father later on, after his work at Daimler-Benz, when he made research work, was still active with piston engines. And I could use it. It was also a big advantage for me, really.
And at what point did you decide to follow your father into becoming an engineer and working for Daimler?
To be an engineer, this was not connected with the idea to go to Daimler. But to be an engineer, this was for me a thing quite normal. And he was for me always the man I had to follow. And when he became professor at the University of Karlsruhe, the whole family had to follow, and so we are always in contact also with him and his work at the university. I was very often in his institute and watched the things he was doing, and then for me it was quite normal that I also started the engineering studies at the university. But after my diploma in Karlsruhe, I said, no, I have to separate a little bit from my father. And I was interested in scientific work, and so I turned over to Stuttgart University and could observe his work only from the distance. And I started with completely different things, and so there I could then prepare my doctor thesis at the Stuttgart University. And after I had finished this work, and then I looked around which company could be interesting for me to start with, and so I went to MAN in Augsburg, which was interesting for me because I was very interested in the large engine for ships, and they built them at MAN. And then I had already a treaty to get to MAN, and then I met one of the Daimler people, and I told him that I would, I'm planning to go to MAN. And then he said, no, you shouldn't go to MAN. And then he told it to some of the people at Daimler that I'm looking for a new job. And then they invited me, and they persuaded me to go to Daimler-Benz, and it was a good decision. I had, during my activities at Daimler-Benz, I had also a chance to change over to the university. I had two, as we call it in Germany, Karls, one to the Berlin University and one to the Braunschweig University. And but I could have started there as professor too, but I stayed at Daimler-Benz, and this was good, and I could make my career there too. And at the end, I was the head of the piston engine development at Daimler-Benz, and also the gearboxes, they were also developed under my management. And it was funny that I had 2 or 3 people in my department who had started their jobs with my father. When he started the automatic gearbox development, they also started with him together. And under my management, they left the company and retired. It was very nice to discuss the development over the time and when all this started. And it was really sometimes for me kind of a family discussion, because I've met so many Daimler people when my father worked with Daimler-Benz, and we sometimes could drive in the test cars, and we had special experiences. I remember one when we were underway and suddenly the gearbox didn't work anymore, only in the retro direction, and we had to go in the wrong direction 15 kilometers. It was at that time not such a problem. There was not much traffic on the road. These were the experiences we had, and so I could learn from these experiences as well later on for my own job.
And I think that Mercedes had made some efforts to apply the direct fuel injection from the DB601 engine also to some, I think, Mercedes Grand Prix engines in the 50s, I think.
Yes,
and
that's
so
right.
on.
This was also an experience which really can be derived from the aero engines, because the Daimler engines were the first who had direct injection. And this was a thing which obviously the Rolls-Royce people didn't accept and didn't think it, didn't realize the advantages of this. And so there at Daimler-Benz they had a lot of experience already, and they started in 1955, they are well informed, for these engines, for racing engines and for the 6 cylinders. But this was not a technology for the large series production. It was too expensive, and so it was only for the high expensive cars, and normal cars they got carburetors as well. But later on, this experience was used, and also for me it was an advantage that there were such a lot of experience with direct injection, which I used then for the diesel engines at first. And it was a great chance we had when we introduced a new direct injection for diesel engines, which is still the main adaptation which is in the market really. And of course the petrol engines, they had also injection, but not into the cylinder head, but into the suction pipes, and so it was not really a direct injection. But nevertheless, we left the carburetor very early. This was also in my time. I had started also a calculating program for the whole inlet systems, and we could calculate the waves of the gas inside the inlet systems. And we found out that this also influenced the carburetor very much, because the gas also returned by vibrations back to the carburetor and returned again and took another portion of fuel with it. And so we had very often at different number of revolutions, we had the sudden too much fuel in the mixture, because the gas had gone several times through the carburetor, and this could be avoided by the injection directly into the pipes. And so this was forced us to introduce the injection and to leave the carburetor. This was also a field in the time of my work at Daimler. Yeah.
Something I'm also very interested for you to record the story of is I was very amazed by your story of how you came to have these
yes
these papers showing your father's sort of all his work at Daimler.
Yes, that's right.
So I'm fascinated to hear again how you came across them.
Yes, it was really a funny thing that in my department they are cleaning up. I had to clean up all the things out which were stapled there, and then we suddenly discovered this collection, and I discovered there the name of my father very often. And so I asked at first at the archive is the right name of Daimler, if they are interested to take this. No, they were not interested. They would have brought it away, and I thought it's impossible. So I took it at home, and so it's still there. Perhaps later on, before I leave this earth, I will take it back to Daimler and will ask them again if they are interested to take them. And if not, then of course, then I send it to you.
Thank you. Please do if they will not have them.
Yeah. For me, it was also an interesting thing how you reported about these interrogations which took place at the end of the war with my father in Britain. And this was a big difference to the other Allied. The French, they really took my father as a prisoner of war, and that was really a bad experience at first. And in Britain, they were brought to a camp. This was, I don't know where it was near London. I don't know exactly. But they were treated very politely. So the interrogation they had was also very interesting for them, because they experienced how much knowledge was collected in Britain already. And so the talks were productive, and he had a good remembrance of it. Well, also the other Allied used the knowledge more or less positive. In America, they had also some of the people. My father didn't have to go to America, but some of his colleagues, they were also interrogated in America. And a more negative experience had the people who lived in the east of Germany, in Dessau at Junkers. And I had the chance to meet one of these engineers from there who was also working at Daimler when I came there, and I met him. And he told me that he was working at Junkers, and they were taken away from the whole family from the Russians. One morning they came, half an hour time, packed the things you need, and then they were transported to the Volga River. They had installed also a development office, a department, and they had to stay there for 5 years. And then, after 5 years, they were sent back to Germany, but then they came there and had nothing. And it was very difficult for these people to build up a new life. And, it is interesting how different the things were. And I also know from some people who had problems with their Daisy connections, and they went to Southern America, and they started a new career in Argentina, and started the aero engine development there. And you have described in your paper also that von der Nüll went to America, and then he was one of the leading engineers for the development of the chargers. And in my practical time at Daimler-Benz, I also used the gathered chargers for our engines, and they are still used today. And so there's again a connection to this old technology during the war.
And in the interrogation I read that took place in London with your father, they also mention that with your father was a gentleman called Dr. Rosa.
Yeah.
And the papers don't mention very much about what Dr. Rosa did, but they mention that he would carry out some calculations for your father in his department.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know anything about Dr. Rosa or what he did for your father.
No, I don't know. I know his name also because he was mentioned in the talks my father had with Dallinger and so on. But Dr. Rothe was one of those who went to South America. And I think that he was one of the leading guys who started this Argentinian development there. But I don't know anything about his further career.
So I think maybe I have two remaining questions. One is maybe from your experience in your career as an engineer, I don't know what would be your advice to young engineers today who are leaving university about to begin their work.
Yes, advice I give them is already during the studies to keep in contact with practical work and not to do their studies quite theoretically. Well, in our time when we studied, this was still necessary. It belonged to the study to have periods of practical time. This was unfortunately reduced to a very small amount today. And my advice to young people is to combine their studies really with practical time to work for half a year in a company, in a development department, and see this and learn this experience there. In Stuttgart area, they have founded a kind of study for engineers. This is the so-called dual education. They combine these studies with practical work, just like my idea, and they do it quite consequently. And and I recommend it to young people to follow this idea, because this has also the effect that when they have worked, for instance, with Daimler-Benz and have worked there during their studies, which normally has a time of 4 years, and then in between there are always half years where they work practically there, they were taken over afterwards. They can be sure to get a good job, and they knew already the company where they work. And so it's a continuous development which they can enter, and therefore I think this is very important for engineers. It is surely not so bad to have also a period of scientific work. I had good experience with it, and it helped me afterwards to introduce scientific methods to the work in at Daimler-Benz, to the practical work. On the one side, I told you that I used the results of my father. He had researched in Karlsruhe, and I introduced him into our development work and started calculation of the gears and of the bearings with methods which were really worked out in the Karlsruhe University. And a second thing was, I also mentioned it, that we calculated the gas flow in the suction pipes of the engines, and so we could really install very early a method how to calculate also the momentum of the torque development over the number of revolutions of the engines, and we could form it, and so I think that this scientific work in combination with practical usage is very helpful, and so I think to combine it is not the wrong thing to do. This is the answer to the questions I can give you. The problem today is that, of course, the young students need a certain love for mathematics and physics and chemics and so on. It is not so easy to understand it for everybody. And so, of course, the number of people who didn't find their target afterwards is still quite large. When I studied at the university, about 40% of my colleagues at the university left the university because they didn't manage it. It was not so easy.
So I think that really completes my list of questions. Before we stop the camera, my only final point is, if you feel I have missed anything important that you would like to add to any of these points, you can give your views if I missed anything you feel is very important.
No, on the contrary, I have to tell you, or I would like to tell you, that I am astonished what you have discovered with your research work, which was unknown to me, and it was most interesting to read the work which you have already prepared, and I'm looking forward to if it will be finished finally. But I can only congratulate you. What you have worked out and researched and found, it is fantastic, really. And so I'm not missing anything. It's in the contrary. I have learned a lot by your work. Yes.